Shalom, this is Nathaniel Banks. I'm a online Bible study teacher. We are going to be looking this afternoon at the state of the black community or the state of the Hebrew community. And there are a couple of scriptures that we're going to be reading. I'll be beginning first of all in Ezekiel chapter 37. And for those of you who may have studied and be studying the scriptures, Ezekiel 37 is the chapter of the dry bones. And so I'm not going to go over the scriptures about the dry bones in detail, but I do want to read a couple of verses, starting at verse 4. Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 4. And it reads as follows. Again he said unto me, Prophesy unto these bones, and say unto them, O dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says the Almighty Yahweh unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Almighty. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, Prophesy to the wind. Prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, Thus says the Almighty, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded, and the breath came unto them, and they lived and stood up on their feet, an exceeding great army. In verse 11, Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried, our hope is lost, and we are cut off for our parts. So we give thanks to the Father for that word of prophecy, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to be relating this scripture to the state of the black community or the state of the Hebraic community. For those of you who spend some time on YouTube, you know that there are quite a few videos on how the true Israelites, the true Hebrew Israelites, are actually people that we would call African American, and specifically in the United States of America, those who are here are from the tribe of Judah. I'm not going to go into a lot of explanation on that. I do want to use that as a beginning point, though, as we talk about the state of the Hebrew community or the state of the black community. And so that's why Ezekiel 37 is so important, because Ezekiel 37, although it was talking about the nation of Israel in Ezekiel's day and time, it's also talking about this nation in our day and time. And as it said, the nation itself is saying, Our bones are dried, our hope is lost, we are cut off for our parts. And so when you start thinking about the condition of the so-called black community, and you know we've done many studies on the state of the black community, but most of the time when we look at those markers, those indicators, they're all in the negative category. And so we keep revisiting these things generation after generation. The word of the community or the word of the culture right now is, Are you woke? In other words, are you aware? And I remember when we were in college in the late 60s and early 70s, we didn't use that terminology. We used, Are you conscious? Is there a conscious community? And so if we really think about our history, especially as it relates to this country, there have been different periods where we've been woke. Okay, we have been awakened. It happened in 1920, for instance, in the 1920s with Marcus Garvey and his movement. It happened in the 1940s with A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters. It happened, of course, in the 1950s and early 60s with the Martin Luther King, who sort of typified the civil rights movement. But in the midst of all of that, the Black consciousness movement came up. It happened again in the 1990s, or 80s and 90s actually, when Rodney King was videotaped being beaten by the Los Angeles police. And now in our day and time in 2015, 2016, 2017 and 18, we're woke again. And in each one of those epochs, if you will, or each one of those periods of time, the thing that wakes us up is oppression and living under the weight of that oppression. So we are always viewing ourselves from the eye of our oppressors. We take our identity, even in a positive sense, from the negative experiences that we have had based on how we are being treated by those who are oppressing us. And in this country, it's primarily the rich and the white, with the assistance of the non-rich and white. So, but nobody seems to be asking the question, how come we have to continually go through these periods of, well, now we're awake. Now we understand what's going on. But then we go back to sleep. What is the original cause of all of that? And I would submit, as we're looking at Ezekiel chapter 37, that really what these statements of the black community being woke are, we're awakened to the fact that we are a dead community, and that there's very, very little to indicate that we've got life in our community. And so in many senses, being woke actually means being aware that we are still suffering as we always have been. But I think it's also time to understand that this isn't the first time, this isn't the first millennium that these things have been going on. So when we look at what Ezekiel was given by the Most High, our people were going through the same thing then. But Ezekiel actually dealt with why our people were going through the same thing. We keep asking the question, why are white folks so mean to us? We keep asking the question, how come we can't just be seen as human beings like everybody else? We keep asking the question, can't you just leave us alone so that we can live our lives the way that you live your life? And the answers that keep coming back to us are no and nullification, just like Martin Luther King said in one of his speeches. So the question has been consistent, and the answer has been consistent. That's not going to happen to us. But we're asking the wrong question, and we're asking the wrong people to answer that question. We should be asking our Creator, Father, what is going on? Why are we in the same position now that we were in before? And why are all of the markers or the indicators of the health of our community or lack thereof, why are they always so consistently bad? That's where we get back to Ezekiel. And so what Ezekiel was told by the Most High is, I want you to go into this valley and preach my word to a dead army. Not only is the army dead, the bones have dried up. So there's no flesh on them anymore. The flesh has rotted away. And all that's left is a bunch of bleached bones. But what I want you to do, Ezekiel, is to prophesy over these bones. Now, nobody asked when we're studying Ezekiel, so what was it that he was prophesying? But the scriptures actually say what he is prophesying. It says in verse 7, so I prophesied as I was commanded. Well, actually, it starts before that. It says, verse 5, thus says the Almighty unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. So the prophecy that Ezekiel has been given is that I have the breath of the Most High to give to you, and once you receive that breath, then you will live. And it's that prophecy that has been neglected or overlooked from the time that we first got woke back in the early 1900s, and actually even in the mid 1800s. It was the same thing happening. But we have not received that message. So the job of the prophet in this age is to say, "O Israel, God is going to cause you to have life again." But before that can happen, Israel has to understand that it does not have life now. And that's the same way it is with our community. We don't have life. And it has to do, the reason we don't have life is because of what we did with life. Well, what does that mean? In order for the Most High to have a relationship with us, He gave us very specific ways to have and be in relationship with Him. And it's sort of encapsulated in the Ten Commandments. But basically, it's what His laws were, the Torah, what He gave to His people in order for them to live. And what He told His people, our people, is that if you do these things, you will live. And so when we look at the things that He told us to do, the first one was, don't have any other God before me. And certainly don't make your own God. And if you do make your own God, don't bow down to that God and worship that God, because I'm jealous and I don't want that to happen. And then He goes on to say throughout the rest of what we would call the Ten Commandments, here are the things that I expect of you. I expect you to set aside a certain time in order to reflect on your relationship with me. I expect you to honor your parents so that you would have a long and healthy life. I expect you to be truthful, to not lie, to not kill, to not steal. I expect you not to want something that someone else wants. And so all of those, what we call commandments, all those laws, were actually the very things that caused us to go into captivity again, because we broke those laws. And so once the laws are broken, the covenant between the Most High and His people gets broken, and He had to make a way for us to get back to Him, because the Most High does not deal with sin and sinners. So sin has to be dealt with. That's where Jesus comes in. Jesus, or Yeshua, became the propitiation for our sins. In other words, the Father said, somebody's got to pay for these things that my people are doing. So I'm going to send Jesus, and you will be the payment. You will be able to buy my people back. Once Jesus did that, though, the message that God has for us is the same message. And that gets us to the state of our community and why we continue to not be woke on an extended basis. It's because we continually choose not to keep His commandments. And so when we don't keep His commandments, that puts us at risk of those who want to see our demise. And that's where we get into our relationship with quote-unquote white America, or any other ethnic group for that matters. Because no matter where you go on the planet, if there are people who look like us, if there are people who came from our heritage, we are despised. And so what we need to understand is that may be the case, but God doesn't despise us. If we will only do what He has given us to do, He will make us the head and not the tail. He will make us below and above and not below. He will make he will make our enemies our footstools. So the lesson for the community is, yeah, you do need to wake up. And that's where I want to read another verse. It's in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14. Well, actually, before I read that, because there's something else that needs to be said too while we're doing this lesson. Let's look first of all at Romans chapter 10, verse 2. Romans 10, verse 2. I'll start actually with verse 1. It says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to Yahweh for Israel is that they might be saved." The Apostle Paul, or Shaul, was telling the people in Rome, who were, some of them were Jews and some of them were Gentiles, but what he was telling them is, my heart's desire for my people, because he was in the nation of Israel, is that they be saved. Well, saved from what? Saved from the oppression that they were underneath, saved from the consequences of sin. Because sin is not something that is a mind thing only. Sin is something that affects your being and has consequences. And that's why another verse in Romans 6:23 says, "The wages of sin is death." When our people live in sin, then we're also living in death, which is why Ezekiel was shown what the results of that look like. Okay, so he says in verse 2, in Romans chapter 10, verse 2, "For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge." Black folks are some of the most religious people that you will ever find. But yet, the knowledge of God is not in us. And it's because you can't know God intellectually. You have to know God by experiencing Him in believing, by obeying what He told you to do. And so what that means is that in order for us to have a knowledge of God and not just a zeal for God, we have to actually do what He tells us to do. And then it says in verse 3, "For they being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God." Let me just be very blunt and explain what that means for us in real time. We talk about those 10 commandments. Let's just take one of them. Let's just take the commandment that says you shall not commit adultery. Do you know that between 70 and 80% of the children in our community that are born out of the bond of marriage, which means that fornication is the rule rather than the exception in our community. And just like the scriptures say, the wages of sin is death. Fornication has brought a death sentence to the black community. And so if we really want to know God, we are going to have to deal with how we are handling His word. So when His word says don't sin, then we have to take Him at His word and not sin. So specifically, when we look at what our community is going through, I was just it doesn't really matter where you go. When you see young black men, what you see is them wearing their pants underneath their butts. Okay, that is a sign of death. It is a sign of people who do not have any respect for themselves or the people who brought them into the world. And it's also a sign of being disconnected from the life that would give you a different way of seeing yourself. I'm using that as an example, not because of that in isolation, but when entire generations of our people are walking around sagging, don't we see that is not from the Most High? That is a indicator of how we have been destroyed as a people. And so how do you stop that? Well, the other thing that goes along with that is they're young men who, most, for all intents and purposes, don't have other men to be with them and show them that you don't walk around with your pants underneath your butt. Now, that would mean, though, that they would have two parents who are actively involved in their lives. Well, how would that happen? We're not fornicating. That's how it happens. Or if I did fornicate, I stopped once I realized what the scriptures were telling me to do. And see, all of these things, I'm using that as the case in point because it's such an obvious act of insanity. Okay, so when our people come to their right minds and say, "Well, Father, what would you have me to do?" He's going to take you back to his commands. Now we can go back to the commands because Jesus has already laid the foundation for us to be able to be covenant keepers now, because he's placed his spirit in us. And by the way, his spirit and his word are the same, one and the same thing. So that's why Paul is saying they are being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness. So our own righteousness has our young men acting like the only thing that's important is sex. That's our own righteousness. Now, they have sex with young women who in most cases are going to somebody's church. So now the church is involved in this act of disobedience because the church has not said to its young people, here are God's standards and we expect you to live up to them. Now the people can do what they want to do, but the message has to be put before our young people so that they will know there are standards that they're expected to live up to. Now, I'm a child of the 60s and nobody sinned any more than I did. So we're not talking about prudishness. We're talking about when I have sinned and I repent of those sins and I confess what I have done. Part of that confession is passing down to the next generation. Here's what God's best is for you, and here's what happens when you don't live up to what God has for you. So on an individual level, that's how we do it. But on a collective level, we have to understand that these things are not acceptable, and this is why we are still asleep, if you will, which is the other, and we'll stop at this verse. It's in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14. And Ephesians 5:14 says, well, actually, I'm gonna have to start at verse 5. Ephesians 5:14. It says, "For this, Ephesians 5:5. For this you know that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of Yahweh. Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things comes the wrath of God on the children of disobedience." That's where we are. Be not therefore partakers with them. Who is he talking to? He's talking about our people. He's saying don't be partakers with the people who are doing those things. And then he says in verse 8, "For you were sometimes darkness, but now are you light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light." That's why he told us, that's why Jesus told us on the Sermon on the Mount, you're the light of the world. If those who are the true nation of Israel, the true children of the Most High, are walking in the light, then we become light to other people. And so that's if we're walking in darkness, how are they going to be able to see what the light is or who the light is? So for I'll read that again. "For you were sometimes darkness, but now are you children light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth." proving what is acceptable unto the Lord, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. That is what we have to do. That is how Ezekiel was preaching to those dry bones. He was reproving the unfruitful works of darkness. For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light, for whatsoever does make manifest is light. And then verse 14 is the one that we were looking for. Wherefore he says, awake you that sleep, and rise from the dead. When the scriptures talk about sleep, they're usually talking about the dead. So being asleep and being dead are the same thing. So when we say we're woke, what we're actually saying is that we have been risen from the dead. And so that's why I would challenge us when we claim to be woke, but yet we still act like the dead. If we're really woke, we will be commandment keepers rather than commandment breakers. If we are really woke, we will be seeking to unify ourselves with one another rather than as whether you look at the internet, whether you look at television, whether you look at YouTube videos and you see all of us coming against one another, and the fact is there's no more unity now in this age than there was when we were in the so-called conscious 60s. The same bifurcation exists, and the reason why it exists is what I'm reading here. We have not surrendered ourselves to the truth, and so there's no way we can be woke. We are aware of our pain, but we're not woke. We're still asleep. We're still dead. And so in order for Christ to give us life, we have to wake up for real. And we have to get up from the dead, and then Christ gives us the light, and then what are we supposed to do with it? As he said in the Sermon on the Mount, we're supposed to let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. So what does that look like in real time? It means I can't be chasing after every woman that I see. It means that I have control once I surrender myself to Yeshua and the things that he has taught. I have control over my body just like he had control over his body, and I tell my body, no, you won't do that because that is a transgression of the law. I tell my family, I will respect you. I take responsibility for my children, not just by giving a check, but by being with them wherever they are and making sure that they have their needs met. If as I am awake, I take care of my wife, and I see her as the person who is a part of me. And if it's a woman, it's the same thing. So that's how our community will wake up. We actually can only wake up if we repent from the deeds of the flesh, which we already know are wrong. So even if nobody in the community is saying it, if nobody from the pulpit is saying it, it doesn't matter. We have an obligation and we have a destiny to fulfill, and the Most High wants to use us, but he's not going to overrule our will. So yeah, the state of the black community in the United States of America is in the same state that it's always been, dead. And so if we want to be alive, if we want to be awakened from our sleep, the scriptures are there to wake us up. Now we have to decide whether we want to be woke or whether we want to stay asleep. The Father has added a blessing to the reading of his word already. Our prayer is that his word would be received and the body of believers that are belonging to his Hebrew nation will wake up in Yeshua's name.